camera I am using to record this video right now is called the Sony a6400. And when I bought it, it cost me about $200 more than an identical equivalent camera with all of the same specs except for one specific feature. So what feature, somebody might be wondering, would be worth it to spend $200 more just to get that one single feature on a camera? No, it's not 4K, it's not the frame rate, it's not the lens, it's not any of that. It is simply the ability to record a video for longer than 30 minutes. That's right. So how in this day and age, with all the technology we have, do we still have cameras that somehow don't have the ability to record a video for longer than 30 minutes? It's not the storage capacity. You can have SD cards with multiple terabytes these days. It's not the technology itself, because clearly I was able to purchase a camera with it. It just costs more money. The reality is camera companies intentionally disable this ability in their cameras to make them cheaper, which brings us to the real question. How is it that a camera with this feature intentionally shut off by the manufacturer, how does that make the camera cheaper? The answer is to get around tariffs. If a camera has the ability to record a video for longer than 30 minutes, it is by law defined as a camcorder, not a camera. And there is a higher tariff on camcorders than there is on cameras. And so to get around this tariff so they can sell a product to the consumer that is more affordable, the camera companies will intentionally cut off the ability of that camera to record a video longer than 30 minutes. This is a perfect example of one of the real life effects of tariffs as a source of revenue for the government. Because in theory, all fiscal policy is there to maximize government revenue. The things the government spends money on, like military spending to protect shipping routes, healthcare spending to keep people healthier and living longer, education spending to keep people smarter and more productive, infrastructure spending to make it easier to have commerce across state lines. These are all things the government spends money on that allegedly should be growing the economy, that increases the tax base for the government. And then the things that they tax are going to give them the revenue that they're after, as long as they don't tax them too much and crush them out of existence. But as Yogi Berra once said, in theory, there is no difference between theory and practice, but in practice, there is. And in reality, fiscal policy doesn't just provide revenue for the government. It also serves as a massive, complicated web of incentives and punishments for different economic behaviors. Consider the tax advantages that somebody might get if they sell their home after they've lived in it for at least 2 years. If you are single, you get to exclude the first 250 grand of profits from your capital gains tax. And if you're married, you get to exclude the first $500,000 of profit from your capital gains. Do you think that this tax break has no influence on how long people live in a home before they decide to try and sell it? Of course it has an influence. It could make the difference of literally hundreds of thousands of dollars being sent to the government or being kept in my pocket. Or what about the fact that there is a higher tax rate on earned income than there is on investment income? Do you think this has no effect on people choosing which one they prefer? Of course it has an effect, especially for those with higher incomes and higher net worths. So the whole tax code is very simply a complex web of incentives for some behaviors and punishments for others. And tariffs are no different. Tariffs are quite simply an extra tax that you pay on something that came from somewhere else instead of coming from here. That's it. In other words, it's a punishment on you for buying something that came from somewhere else versus something that came from here. Now, don't get me wrong. I am not saying tariffs are inherently bad, at least not yet. After all, the entire federal government was funded exclusively by tariffs and excise taxes up until 1913. The income tax did not exist outside of the few years the Civil War was happening. The income tax did not exist in the United States until 1913. In fact, most people are not aware of this, but tariffs themselves were actually the main driver behind the Civil War. If you haven't read it already, I highly recommend the book, The Real Lincoln by Thomas J. DiLorenzo. It will shatter your view of history. So I'm not saying tariffs are inherently bad, but we do have to be honest about the real effects that tariffs have on economic activity. And by the way, if you're looking for somebody to walk you through exactly what comes next for America, and more importantly, what you can do about it, you need to subscribe to my brand new newsletter. Letters from a Heretic. It's the only place where I'm going to go deeper into some of these topics that I seriously doubt you're going to hear about from anyone else. As soon as you sign up, you're going to start receiving my 5-day series called The Most Dangerous Ideas in America. These are ideas so powerful they could reshape the economic landscape of our nation. We talk about things like the real reason we could be on the verge of World War III, the rise of the House of Saud, the true location of the financial all-seeing eye, a secret manuscript that predicted the end of America, and what it means for your wealth. We talk about America's coming dark summer and even the final phase of the US dollar. So if you're interested in receiving that so you can make better decisions about how to grow and protect your wealth, especially during times of crisis, click the link below, enter your email, and I'll start showing you everything I know. You can group the results that tariffs have on economic activity into 2 main categories. Result number 1 is that tariffs discourage people from purchasing things from outside the country by making them more expensive than they would be otherwise. As an example, let's consider olive oil. All things considered, let's say you prefer olive oil that comes straight from Italy instead of olive oil that comes from California. But in order to stimulate American business, they're going to increase the tariffs on Italian olive oil so much so that it becomes artificially expensive. Not just more expensive than it would be otherwise, but a high enough tariff where it's more expensive than the Californian olive oil. In this case, you might prefer the Italian olive oil still, but because you can't afford it any longer, you're going to buy the California olive oil instead. So the effect number 1 of a tariff is to discourage people from purchasing things from outside the country by making them more expensive than they would be otherwise. But tariffs have a second result that is never discussed in these meetings when they're talking about implementing new tariffs or taxes. And that is that tariffs incentivize people to find loopholes around the punishments that end up resulting in subpar outcomes for everyone, even if they are better than the tariff itself. I'm going to say it again. Tariffs incentivize people to find a way around the tariff so that they can avoid the punishment. This results in suboptimal outcomes, but people choose them because they're still better than the tariff itself. Take my camera that I talked about earlier as an example. I've heard countless stories. It happened to me myself from people that didn't know that cameras had an artificial limit of 30-minute recording times built into them. They go to capture some footage, just assuming that the camera will record until the space on their memory card runs out. An hour or an hour and a half later, they look back and they realized all of that final footage is completely gone, lost. It was never recorded to begin with because the camera stopped recording at 30 minutes. Yes, they saved $100 or $200 on the camera purchase to begin with, but now they have a suboptimal product that they didn't want in the first place. Or let's take another example. This example comes from Converse shoes. And if you've never noticed, these shoes have a partially fuzzy bottom on the sole. And no, this fuzzy bottom does not give them extra grip. And no, it is not cheaper for Converse to make their shoes this way. So why would they do this? Well, it just so happens that shoes have a higher tariff than slippers. And for something to be legally considered a slipper, the bottom of the sole must be covered with at least 50% a fuzzy felt-like material. And so as a result of this extra high tariff on shoes specifically, it has left consumers with the choice of choosing something that is legally considered a slipper, leaving them with a higher cost because there's extra materials, and a suboptimal product because it's probably at least a little bit less grippy than a regular shoe, or they have to pay a higher price for a shoe with a normal sole. And all the while, the price of all of this fuzzy felt-like material is being driven artificially higher than it would be otherwise because of this artificial extra manipulated demand for the fuzzy stuff, making life more expensive and more difficult for any other consumer who needs to buy fuzzy stuff. Now, obviously, this is a common theme that you see pop up with tariffs, but it is true of all taxes. This is how fiscal policy works. Because with any legal policy, any law, any regulation you're going to try and enforce, you have to define the terms. If you're going to tax extra on a camcorder, you have to define what is a camcorder? What's the definition? Where do you draw the line between a camcorder and a camera? If you're going to put an extra tax on shoes, but not slippers, where do you draw the line? What defines a shoe versus a slipper? If you're going to place an extra tax on tractors that were built in Mexico and then transported into America from there, how much of it has to be built there? What's the definition of a tractor? Can you build the individual pieces there, ship them all together over here, and assemble them together here? If so, how many of those parts can be pre-assembled in Mexico before shipping it across the the border and completing the final assembly here? Could you build it in a way where it's legally defined as a different machine, maybe a car or a truck, or heck, even a lawnmower if you attach a blade to it so that it doesn't qualify as a tractor, and then once you ship it across the border, modify or remove the part so that it's now a tractor that can be sold? Now, if all of these questions sound preposterous, they're not. This is what happens every day. In fact, for years, this is what Ford was dealing with something called the chicken tax. The chicken tax is a leftover tariff from the 1960s that is placed on cargo vehicles. While passenger vehicles have a 2.5% tariff, cargo vehicles have a 25% tariff. And so Ford found an expensive but brilliant solution. Their 12-passenger vans were manufactured the exact same way as their cargo vans. The only difference was the seats and the safety equipment. Obviously, it's more expensive to make a passenger van than a cargo van. All things considered, same cost, extra materials because you have the seats and the seat belts and the safety equipment. But Ford found that if they made the 12-passenger vans, shipped those across the border, even though they paid for the seats and the safety equipment, and then once they got to America, they paid somebody, labor, hours of work, in order to go remove those seats that they didn't need, now they've transformed it into a cargo van that they can sell that was still cheaper overall than paying the 25% tariff. Now, this obviously resulted in those cargo vans being a much higher cost for the end consumer than they would have been otherwise. But it was still cheaper than what those cargo vans would have been if they were imported as a cargo van and had the tariff assigned to them as a cargo van, which meant that the only thing the tariff did was cause those cargo vans to be more expensive and waste materials that Ford had to put in there in order to try and get a lower tax rate. Wasted material, higher cost, wasted labor. And while Ford finally stopped doing this and they settled to pay a $365 million fine to the government as a punishment, it doesn't mean that basically every company in existence is always trying to find ways to do similar things. And the more tariffs increase, the more incentive there will be to try and find ways around them. And we need to be clear, this is not just so corporations can have bigger profits. A 25% higher cost on the van is translated to the consumer. That's 25% more that you have to pay if you want to buy that. And so by companies finding a way around them, it allows them to sell these things at a cheaper cost than they would by just taking on the full tariff. Because again, at the end of the day, it's the consumer that buys the product, and consumers will buy less of it if that item costs more. And it's obviously true that all taxes operate this way, not just tariffs. Anything that gets taxed is disincentivized. Anything that gets subsidized is incentivized. Without taxes or subsidies, without credits or deductions, just left up to their own decisions, people would simply be able to choose what they want. Their decisions wouldn't be influenced by something being artificially more expensive or artificially cheaper. Money would flow where it's best suited, where it's most needed, and no artificial manipulation of the economy would be taking place. And that's kind of the point of all of this. To the extent that the US economy is suffering right now, it's not a result of the wrong mix of government intervention. It's not because they just haven't controlled us the right way yet. It's not because we need our political overlords to punish us or reward us differently so that we can have our lives improved. People are suffering because we need the government to get off our backs. They are the problem. We don't need tariffs instead of taxes or taxes instead of tariffs. We need less taxes and less tariffs. The solution isn't changing which source the government takes its income from. The solution is to reduce its income from all sources and for them to stop spending like there's just an infinite amount of it. But as it stands for the foreseeable future, this is the world that we live in. And lucky for us, there are still plenty, unlimited actually, ways to profit, to make money, to create wealth, and to get ahead. As long as there are people pulling the strings, manipulating the system to their own advantage, there will be ways for us to get on the right side of the fence too. Use that manipulation for our own advantage as well. Nobody's coming to save us. It might not be your fault that you're poor, but if you want to get rich, it is your responsibility. And if you'd like me to help you apply ideas like this to your investing, click on the link in the description below. As always, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.